right, we are going to shift direction, but not too much direction, actually. I think our next speaker and presentation is going to flow really quite nicely from what we just heard from Johan Hari. I loved hearing Johan talk about the stories and that power of storytelling, and I think stories is very much going to have influenced our next speaker's work. So it is my great pleasure to next up introduce Clare Davies, who's the CEO of SHARC. Clare Davies is the CEO of the Self-Help Addiction Resource Centre, and SHARC, if you don't know, is a peer-led organisation that has co-produced programs to support people who've been impacted by alcohol and other drugs, and also more recently, gambling as well. SHARC has been promoting and advocating for lived experience through services, programs and policies for more than 25 years. And Clare joined SHARC in 2022, having held leadership positions in the not-for-profit sector for 15 years. She's also a Churchill Fellow and Harvard Club of Victoria Not-for-Profit Fellow and the current Vice President of VADA. She's going to be talking today about the power of the lived experience. So please put your hands together and make her welcome.
Hi everybody, hang on, I'll get that to the correct height. That was just so fabulous. I also want to thank Auntie Erica. That was an amazing experience to witness this morning with the Welcome to Country. And I also want to begin by acknowledging the country we're standing on, the ancestral lands of the Yugambeh people, and I hope I've pronounced that correctly. And to pay my deep respects to elders past and present. I want to honour the ongoing connection between people, culture, story and country. And I acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. It's so nice to be with you today. I've already bumped into a heap of people I know, and I'm hoping to spend some more time with the rest of you as the conference goes on. I want to begin this today with gratitude to everyone that's here with lived and living experience of alcohol or other drug or gambling harm. I know it's probably everyone in the room, to be honest, but people that have got experience of recovery, addiction, harm reduction, service use, exclusion and survival. Thank you for the wisdom you carry, the grief you hold, and the courage it takes to keep believing that something better is actually possible. And to the pioneers who came before me who don't get anywhere near enough recognition for the work they've done, I'm so profoundly grateful for the work you've done, the people in the lived and living experience space. We've always called it at SHARC, we were always known, or we called ourselves experts by experience. So some of these terms have sort of been put on us, but I'm using quite a few of the terms that have been put on us in this talk I'm giving you today. Words, right? And definitions. I'm not going into a lot of that, but we do need to get to it. I know I stand here standing on the shoulder of giants. So peer support and peer work is everywhere now. It is so sexy right now. It's in strategies, funding guidelines, titles, job titles, committees, frameworks and tenders. Yet it remains one of the most misunderstood parts of our alcohol and drug system, and I would say more broadly mental health and a number of other aligned systems. Because the language of lived experience has become mainstream, but the assumptions about peer work haven't shifted nearly as much. Peers are still often seen as a nice to have, or worse, a story and not a skill. And those assumptions matter, because how we understand peer work shapes how we fund it, how we protect it, and whether we allow it to do what it has always done best, interrupt cycles of harm by restoring dignity, relationship and agency. Today I want to make one core argument. Peer work is not symbolic inclusion, it's a knowledge-based discipline. And we treat it that way, everything will change. And we're seeing it change already. So peer work has been surrounded by myths for an incredibly long time. And I know you're going to know a whole heap of these, and I could get like hands raised and you can call out all the rest to me, but I'll just name a few. Some of my favourites, peer workers are too fragile. It's just a stepping stone to a real job. They're being paid to be friendly. Anyone could do what they do. The lived experience on its own is the same as peer practice. We've heard all of these again and again, and I know you'll have hundreds more. The problem is, those myths don't just sound wrong, they do real damage. They quietly shape things like short-term funding, low pay, the lowest pay of anyone in the service you're working in, and poor conditions. And that matters, because when peer work is misunderstood, the work itself gets reshaped. It gets diminished, its depth is lost, its authority is lost, and too often the power to change lives is lost with it. So if peer work isn't informal sharing, and if it's not entry level, and it's not anecdotal, what exactly is it? It is knowledge. It's hard-won knowledge. It's embodied, and too often dismissed because it does not look like traditional expertise. Knowledge shaped in the body, and it's knowledge carried through experience. Knowledge that notices what formal systems nearly always miss, what safety feels like, where trust breaks, and what harm leaves behind. It asks very different questions. Questions like, what does safety feel like here? What's the first thing that someone will stop telling us once trust breaks? This kind of knowledge does not sit neatly in a manual, but it does not make it vague. When it's properly understood, it is repeatable, teachable, and accountable. This knowledge does not need to compete either with research or design because it strengthens both. And the evidence is clear and it's everywhere. There's lots of literature around this. Actually, peer work's probably one of the most studied disciplines there is. And we don't ask doctors, how effective are you? But we ask that of peer workers all the time in all the research that we do. So what peer work does is helps people stay engaged, build connection, navigate systems, and when it's needed, it really challenges systems, improves outcomes across the continuum of care. But that only happens when we stop treating peers as voices to be included and start recognising them as practitioners of a discipline. I want to ground this in history. SHARC's been a peer-led and peer-governed organisation for more than 30 years. And hello to all the Sharkies that are in the room today. I'm really amazingly honoured to be the CEO of SHARC. I really feel like its current custodian. And like all my predecessors, I hold a designated lived experience role. So for us, this is nowhere near new. Designated lived experience roles have been a part of the SHARC world for over 30 years now. And I know that's the same for some of your services as well. SHARC's been advocating for our community long before peer work was fashionable, long before it was funded, and long before any of these frameworks existed. The discipline wasn't created by policy. It was shaped by communities, by people navigating stigma, criminalisation, family separation, loss and recovery. I also want to acknowledge the peer-led organisations across Australia that have been carrying this work for decades. Quinn, that's here today, Quiver in Queensland, and for the role that all of us are continuing to play in strengthening lived experience leadership. One of the most hopeful things to emerge from the Royal Commission in Victoria's mental health system, and there haven't actually been that many, has been the deepening connection between peer-led services across the system, mental health, AOD and harm reduction. A commitment to work together, back one another, and really importantly, learn from one another's very distinct histories, like how we started, where we came from and where we're going. More than 2 decades ago, my life looked incredibly different. It was shaped by chaos. I was a daily heroin user. I was instability, violence, and the constant calculations that come with trying to survive when your world reads your life as a failure. For many of us, the pathway into addiction is absolutely not mysterious. It's written through poverty, trauma, racism, violence, housing insecurity, and abandonment. People do not fall out of the sky into suffering. We are shaped by conditions. Many of us learn that the systems we're told to trust are often the same systems that manage us, judge us, and contain us, and worst of all, disappear us. What changed my life was not a single intervention or a professional. It was peer support in my community. People who saw me, who offered me knowledge, people who showed me how to rebuild a life when you've been told repeatedly that your life has no value. Because the transformation that happens after an experience like this is not just about stopping harm, it's about becoming visible to yourself again. It's about rebuilding meaning, trust, and the sense that your life belongs to you. That was peer support. I actually just didn't have the language for it yet. About 25 years ago, I was employed for my lived experience right here on the Gold Coast. We didn't call it peer work then. The name's right, they chase us. I hadn't finished school, I hadn't been to university, and I didn't have any formal qualifications. What I did have was a life I had survived. And mentors taught me that this experience could be used intentionally, that it could become practice, which blew my mind. That was my qualification. Deep reflection on my life, in concert with my community, is what we now know as lived expertise. But I was told I was probably the last of my kind because the system was gentrifying and we were moving towards this thing like minimum qualifications. That if I actually wanted a career, I should go to university and become a doctor or a psychologist. And yet, I found that quite curious because it wasn't clinical intervention that changed my life most fundamentally. Absolutely, it was needed, but it was not the thing that was fundamentally what helped me. It was my peers, people who had gone before me and could guide me through this bizarre maze of life. And still the system did not know how to hold people like me. There was no clear role, no supervision model, and absolutely no career pathway. And certainly no recognition that lived experience itself was a discipline. You could be employed because of your lived experience, but the system still didn't know how to hold you. And over time, communities did something very deliberate, like we did at SHARC. They protected the work, they named the work, and eventually we professionalised it on our own terms. Not to sanitise it, but to keep it safe. So if peer work is a discipline, then disciplines need scaffolding. Across the country, important work is underway to strengthen the lived and living experience workforces. One example, and I know there's many, is the lived and living experience discipline frameworks developed in Victoria. 5 frameworks authored by our communities. SHARC was honoured to author 2 of them in conjunction, co-designed with the people that are the lived and living experience workforce. They name the breadth of this workforce: peer researchers, policy workers, advocates, managers, lived experience leaders, and lived experience governance, all leading through a primary lens of lived experience. I want to be really clear about their purpose. These frameworks are not about fitting peers into the system. These frameworks define scope, articulate competencies, embed supervision that is understood by peer work, absolutely not clinical supervision for peer work, creating safety for workers, organisations and the people receiving support. And most importantly, they protect the relational heart of lived experience practice. Without clarity, peers are vulnerable. With clarity, we can lead. And we also need to let go of the idea that peer work can exist only on the edges. If you want an example of what scalability can look like, look up Flourish Australia's Why Not a Peer Worker strategy. It's a practical example of an organisation deliberately designing for peer work at scale. So scalability is not a barrier, and it can be done cost neutral. The real question is whether systems are willing to design for it well. And that should not include it should include far more lived experience services across Australia. It's actually quite bizarre how few lived experience-led services there are in this country. Not just peer roles embedded in mainstream services, but services designed, governed and delivered by people with lived and living experience. because some of the strongest peer work happens when peer practice is not added in later, but built in from the start. Peer workers still face real risk at work. Sometimes it's overt discrimination, and sometimes it's softer than that. And it's a term that we've started to talk about at SHARC a lot, soft stigma. Different rules, lowered expectations, and a reluctance to offer honest feedback for fear that we might not cope. But that is not protection, that is stigma. And it strips people of the dignity of accountability. It also asks us to look at who is actually in the room. Do our peer teams, and more broadly our workforces, reflect the communities we serve? Are they culturally safe? Because representation is not a nice extra. It shapes whether people feel recognised, safe, and able to trust what is being offered. And if we do not design workplaces that understand lived experience labour, that recognise the emotional load and distribute responsibility properly, then we are not honouring lived experience. We are consuming it. And beneath all of this is the big, deep issue, power. Because in many settings, what we call power sharing has never really required the system to give up anything. Our stories do matter. He was right. They always have. But if all the system does is listen to our stories and carry on unchanged, that is not transformation. Transformation is when lived experience shape what gets built, what gets funded, and what gets measured, and who gets to decide. That is the learning edge of the movement now. Not where the peer work belongs, but how we embed it ethically, safely, and with real authority. So here is my invitation to the sector. The question is no longer whether lived experience leadership matters. The question is, how can your organisation support us? Is it through auspicing lived experience groups? SHARC actually does that. Helping lived experience communities build their own organisations, sharing resources, infrastructure, power, and backing in ways that grow real authority. Let's grow the alcohol and drug system in ways that strengthen lived experience leadership and keep the soul of peer work intact. And I would argue the soul of the AOD sector intact. 5 to 10 years from now, lived experience leadership should not look like a special initiative or a brave exception. It should look like normal. It should look business as usual. It means lived experience leadership is embedded and not appended. People lived and living experience should be in governance, in executive roles, leading teams, holding budgets, and shaping policy from the start, not brought in at the end to validate decisions that everyone else has already made. It looks like organisations finally growing up about power, not just inviting people to have a voice, but sharing authority, decision-making and risk. It means we've stopped confusing representation with leadership. Instead of expecting one person to carry a whole community, we have clear roles, proper resourcing, supervision and career pathways, so lived experience leaders can lead sustainably. It also means practice is caught up with principle, a lot less glossy strategies and frameworks, and more meaningful change in how funding occurs. Most importantly, whose knowledge counts, how risk is managed, and how staff are supported when lived experience does challenge the status quo, and I continue to keep doing so, everyone with lived experience. And most importantly, it means systems are more effective and more humane. Services make more sense, people are less harmed by the help they seek, outcomes improve because policy and practice are shaped by people who know, in their bodies and in their lives, what works and what doesn't. Let's elevate peer work in ways that grow lived experience leadership, strengthen design and protect workers, without losing the relational authenticity that made peer support transformative in the first place. Peer work is not a phase. We're not going anywhere. It's not a stepping stone to becoming a clinician, and it's not a story we borrow. It's a discipline built by a community, shaped by practice, and we're ready to lead. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? Thank you for that powerful, powerful presentation and talk. Any questions from the room? If you do, put your hand up. We have some roaming mics. While perhaps people are thinking of a question, I'm going to just ask one that's come through online from Christina, who says she's working with amazing harm reduction peer workers, and they're doing an amazing job. However, there's no insurance to cover them at workplaces. What can we do to fill this gap, and what's your view?
That's interesting that there's no insurance to cover them. I might need to know, like, I probably need to know a bit more information before answering that. That does sound bizarre and wrong.
Perhaps this person can reach out to you and ask that question and get some advice.
Exactly, and maybe from, I don't know what state they're from as well. I know there's people here from all over Australia, so it could be a state-based thing, I'm not sure. That's terrible.
Hi there. I just wanted to ask you if you could possibly share a little bit about your experience with, your peers and how that was transformative for you, in your recovery journey.
Yeah, sure. When I started my recovery journey, it was like from the very first day I was there, when I was leaping off a huge amount of everything. Peers were there for me from the very beginning, and however many decades later from that now, they're still there for me today. I use it in my leadership. Peers are there for me to support me as someone who's in recovery, but that's also a leader who's a CEO. And there's a few others of us here today, I know as well. They support me to understand how to, work in this world, dealing with what you deal with from what led you to be in addiction in the first place. It's an ongoing life journey for me. And I don't mean, peers are there constantly. I think that's probably the answer. I have deep networks of connection to community that I lean on all the time.
Time for one more question. Am I going to do the sprint across the room? Okay.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks for your honesty and sharing your hope. When we're talking about peer workforce, it's deeply seated in advocacy, and as a peer supervisor, it's something that a lot of peers bring to supervision is balancing advocacy and knowing the difference between advocacy and activism. What's your advice for peer workers to stay true to the core of the values of the peer work, but also understand the environments they're working in?
Yeah, that is a very good question and something that comes up all the time. I think there's also a bit of a responsibility on employers here as well. Like if you're employing an activist, you probably would know that that's what the role you're going to, that's what the role is. I think there's a very big difference between advocacy and activism. And I think your position descriptions are probably the place to start there. I think we're running a program at the moment that's a statewide system transformation program with Yale University and Dr. Louise Byrne in Victoria. And one of the big key components of that is really drilling into job descriptions. What is it exactly you're asking people to do? And then it's the employer's role to actually make sure that any of your staff would be working to the position. So that's my very quick answer. It's obviously a lot more detailed than that, but for here and now with employers, I think that's a really important thing. It's be clear about what you're employing someone for.
Thank you. I think we are at time. Please, one more round of applause for that fabulous presentation.